Oh, yeah, I'm giving you a lot of great ideas. But before we do that, I'm going to move on to our next presenter, Aloha Johnson, who is the creator for Asian Pacific American Women's Cultural History at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Mahalo Aloha for taking the time to be with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And everyone can see it okay? Yep, okay, great. So as Shanna mentioned, my name is Aloha Johnston, and I was hired at the Smithsonian as part of the American Women's History Initiative. And so the initiative is actually pan-institutional, meaning that there are different American Women's History Initiative curators that are seated across the Smithsonian's 19 museums and 9 research centers. So I'm based at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center unit. And so I report up through the Asia Pacific American Center, but really embrace the spirit of AWHI, the American Women's History Initiative. And our guiding star is to strive for a society where gender inequity is eradicated and the role of women in history is well known, accurate, acknowledged, and empowering for citizens. And our near star is to create a more equitable and just American society. The Smithsonian leads in creating, educating, and disseminating and amplifying the historical record of the accomplishments of women. And everyone kind of jokes that I have like the longest title of anyone at the Smithsonian, you know, Asia Pacific American Women's Cultural History. But what that does is that really gives me a lot of range to kind of explore things that I find interesting. And so I am by training an art historian, and my background has been in the arts, art museums and art education. But with this position, I have the ability to do some deep dives into things and into stories that I otherwise hadn't when I was working specifically within the realm of art history. And the focus really for AWHI and for the Smithsonian at large is education and access. And so for like many of us, you know, when COVID put everybody into telework scenarios, our digital futures became digital now. It was like immediately get to producing digital resources. And with that in mind, our goals through AWHI are to develop and support programs and resources that promote gender and equality, to empower new generations to advance the role of women, and to reframe the way we learn about, celebrate, and validate significant moments and people. And we adopt and enact models for storytelling about people who have been pushed to the margins. We are also a digital first initiative, and the initiative was started about 2 years ago, and that was always an aspect of the initiative from the very beginning. And so what that means for the curators is that oftentimes when we are thinking about sharing information, we look to digital platforms as much as we would look to print media as well. And our audiences for AWHI are next gen. So we're looking at college undergraduates, teens, elementary and middle school students, and early learners. Some of the things that AWHI supports across the different units within the Smithsonian are events like the National Youth Summit, the upcoming, the past summit looked at teen resistance to systemic racism. You can also find pre-K through 12 resources that look at settler colonialism and revolution. One thing I will say is that the Smithsonian does not shy away from hard-hitting topics and for complicated histories. And so we often will, through research, articulate what subjects people might otherwise find very difficult to tackle within the classroom. We develop exhibitions and teacher resources with those kinds of topics in mind. And we also have an internship program. So I'm very happy to see that there are students here today in hopes that some of them would be inspired to pursue an internship at the Smithsonian with AWHI at some point in their future. And AWHI also supports traveling exhibitions that are developed by the Smithsonian and then tour around the world. So I was hired as one of the first kind of pool of curators, and the hiring of curators was prioritized within the initiative because changing the historical record requires changing how we research, display, and collect women's history. And so one of the I think, important aspects to that is that I'm Kanaka Weavy and I am based in Kaibiki, Hawaii. And so I get to stay in Hawaii and um, channel the resources of the Smithsonian into my community here, while then also channeling the knowledge and expertise of our community into the institution where I work. And I think that's a really powerful dynamic to keep expertise within communities and to also deliver on what the Smithsonian does, and that is the diffusion of knowledge and to serve as a national museum and research complex. Digital. So I mentioned that we are a digital first initiative, and the digital aspect of AWHI, has become exponential as we've moved into what is a dual pandemic, one of COVID and racial justice. And so we've identified some goals and target audiences as we look toward our digital resources. And one of the goals is to increase trusted sources about American women and their historical contributions, to increase engagements with middle school students, college students, and BIPOC women and girls, and to increase the gender balance online. So if you go to the Because of Her Story website, you'll see that we have a really active blog that has expertise and content expertise that relates to not only the collection, but events that are happening in popular culture. And so some of the focus areas, as you can see, include activism, education, art and design, and you can search collections that relate to those topics. And you can also find other kinds of resources that relate to those areas as well. One of the things that I think I'm really proud of from the past year is, of course, that 2020 commemorated the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920. And there was a huge social media campaign within the Smithsonian in partnership with Library of Congress and other partners and collaborators. And one of the if you look at the women's voting history, you may not know, those are they're short, like 1-minute animated series that, or episodes, part of a series. And the episode that focused on Wilhelmina Dowsett and Hawaii's history with suffrage actually received the highest number of views. And in terms of increasing the gender balance online, what we found is that for our Wikipedian in residency for gender and equity, in the overview, one of the things that I found really impressive is that the top performing images were of women of color, and Queen Liliuokalani is among those. And Queen Liliuokalani has inspired a lot of work within the Smithsonian, in fact. We've done conversation kits. Those are resources you can find on our website, which I'll scroll through at the end. And we also have done webinar sessions looking at how her life and her legacy inspired civic engagement. And I think the fact that we continue to see stories of Hawaii and Hawaii's figures continually being of interest to a national and international audience is indicative of the fact that people don't know Hawaii's history and are fascinated by it. And there's a place for telling nuanced histories and non-dominant narratives. So there are these inherited versions of history that people just sort of assume. And as they start to do deeper dives into why it is that Hawaii has royalty and what that means, and the tenuous relationship between Hawaii and the US through American imperialism, those are all topics that we explore through the work at the Asia Pacific American Center. And it's a wonderful platform to be able to share these complex histories of Hawaii and also the incredibly empowering legacies of people like Queen Liliuokalani. So as I mentioned, I'm one of the curators at the Asia Pacific American Center. And if you go to the Smithsonian, you will not find a museum called the Asia Pacific American Center. We have an office and we are working on developing the first ever Smithsonian exhibition gallery. But right now we are a center and our programs and our research live across other programs at the Smithsonian, and they also live across partnerships. So actually earlier in the year, we partnered with the Kona Historical Society on a film screening. Kona Historical Society is an affiliate museum of the Smithsonian. We love building partnerships and sharing resources. And basically, you know, we're all made stronger through those kinds of connections and collaborations. And at a museum without walls like the Asia Pacific American Center, we truly embrace that as an important part of our practice and an important aspect of what we do on a day-to-day basis. One of the things, if you go and visit the Asia Pacific American Center website, you will come across a lot of educational resources. We have a really robust program in education, thanks in part to my colleague, Andrea Kim Neighbors, who is the manager of education initiatives within the Asia Pacific American Center. And one of her recent projects is this, Making Art and Global Interconnections. And this is a module series that is made for educators, K-12 educators, and it brings together artists and educators to figure out how to do arts integration in ways that meet benchmarks and in ways that can live within the virtual classroom, because all of this was developed within the time of COVID. So very responsive to the moment, but with a lot of content expertise that I think will endure beyond COVID. And so I would encourage, all of you to utilize this resource. It's actually brand new, so it's a series, and I think there are only a couple of modules that are up now. But by the end of the year, the series will be available entirely online. And I was one of the art historians that was included in this series, and I partnered with an educator who, again, had no idea about Hawaiian history and was like blown away by the story of Queen Liliuokalani. And we did an analysis of photographs of her, archival photography. I think, as Dawn mentioned, it's like, I don't think I'm the only person who just nerds out on black and white photography. I think it just, people love it. And so we developed a project where, working from a photograph, people, kids at home would take their own selfie and then develop a drawing based on their photograph, and then kind of figure out what sort of symbols they would want to include in their image and how does that represent them. And so we sort of deconstructed the context around the images and the symbols within photographs of Queen Liliuokalani, which is just tons of fun for me. Like, I just love that this is not like a side hustle, that this is what I get to do every day. This research is so important and so much fun. I just love it. Another project that we've done as an educational resource that is a partnership between curatorial research and education and access is a webinar series called We Are Not a Stereotype. Again, really the brainchild of Andrea Kim Neighbors, my colleague at APAC. And what we did is, myself and another AWHI curator named Ashley Corin, who works at the National Portrait Gallery, looked at a series of caricatures of Queen Liliuokalani. We looked at a photograph of her, and then we looked at a caricature. And then we compared that to a lot of racist imagery of African-American and Black people that was produced around the same time, and why it is that that sort of rhetoric and that sort of imaging worked hand in hand. And what that meant for a kingdom trying to protect itself against colonialism, and the relationship to anti-Blackness sentiment that was prevalent and manifest destiny that was prevalent. And so we created a 1-hour webinar series where Ashley and I did a thinking routine where we look, think, and wonder through these series of images that are part of the Smithsonian collection, talking about racism. And that was also for K-12 students. If you go to our website, you will find a Learning Together page, and that's where you can access a lot of these resources. It's also where you can find some general history. And as I mentioned, we don't shy away from the complicated stories. And so we do talk on our website about American occupation of Hawaii. And we talk about the technology, what would Queen Kapiolani's, so Queen Kapiolani's va'a is in the collection at the Smithsonian, and that object actually inspired so many incredible projects within the Smithsonian and within communities here on Hawaii Island as well. And it got a lot of people thinking, like when Queen Kapiolani traveled to the US, what sort of technology would she have experienced to get her from place to place to place? And what are the implications of that technology? And so you can see here, like in one excerpt, we talk about the fact that the railroad ended up displacing a lot of Native American communities, that it was exploitive in terms of labor, but that oftentimes that's a story that goes untold, and what people hear about is sort of this triumphant story of technology in the modern era being, you know, railroads. And so again, just looking at things in layers and not shying away from the many facets of history. One of our, I think, one of our most exciting projects that we have going on, and this is an ongoing series called Our Stories, and this is overseen by my colleague, another curator of Hawaii and the Pacific named Kalava Correa. And Our Stories is a digital storytelling platform. And so he's done all kinds of incredible work in the classroom with students, training them on how to utilize technology, not only to record, but to tell news stories. And so this is a really exciting project. It is ongoing. I think he was supposed to do work in the Pacific, in the Marshall Islands, and in American Samoa. And that has come to a screeching halt because of COVID. But, you know, everyone is creatively adapting and figuring out how best to get these resources into our communities and how to partner with people in order to share their stories without it being necessarily over-determined or over-curated through another person's interpretation, but really empowering people to use their own voice and to share. So with that, you know, these are just a list of websites that you can visit. Many of them are on our Smithsonian APA website. I've also shared the Women's History website and the Learning Together page. I've also shared Andrea Kim Neighbor's email address. She would have been here with me sharing together in this presentation, but the time difference made it such, and the nature of her trying to wrap up the webinar series that she's on meant that I am the one delivering the presentation, but truly the work is a collaboration across many people at the Smithsonian. And Andrea would be a wonderful point person if people have questions about educational resources or potential partnerships. And then of course myself, I truly hope that everybody will hold on to my email and reach out when opportunities arise, or even just to stay connected. It's wonderful. I've had a great time listening to the other presenters as well today. I have questions for both of them. I just love learning about these new resources. So thank you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Hello. That was awesome. Oh, wow. I learned so much. I will open up for